So I'm going to focus on a piece of the whole today, a particular topic of accelerating startups in the entrepreneurial university, StartX and the paradox of success at Stanford. But first, I'll say a little bit about how I came to this topic. I'm a sociologist by training and background. And in the mid-70s, after the first energy crisis, a friend had organized a firm to develop and commercialize solar photovoltaics technology in California. And I'm from New York. So I went to California and I interviewed the scientists in the firm, mostly physicists. And they said to me, we don't write articles, we go for patents. And then they also said, and then they didn't seem to be an industrial scientist. So they didn't fit the model of the academic scientist. But on the other hand, they weren't part of a large bureaucracy in a firm. It seemed that they were the ones who were financing this firm. These were people who had made money from stock options in the semiconductor industry in Silicon Valley. And partly for social reasons and economic reasons, they were involved in forming this firm. And so since they didn't fit either the academic model or the industrial model, but seemed to be doing something different, I defined them as entrepreneurial scientists. And then the consultants to the firm were from the chemistry department at the University of California, Los Angeles. They didn't seem any less entrepreneurial, although they had no interest at that time in forming a business. But they were looking for all kinds of sources of support for their research groups from different government agencies, from companies like the one that I was studying. And so I began to look at the phenomenon of entrepreneurial scientists getting some research funds from the National Science Foundation and doing interviews and studying. And in 1983, I wrote an article and published an article called Entrepreneurial Scientists and Entrepreneurial Universities in American Academic Science. I didn't realize at the time, but apparently nobody had yet defined that topic. And this was the first article on it. But the danger of being ahead or very early is that today when people write review essays in the field of entrepreneurial university, which is now a large research topic in innovation studies and business, they usually don't go back more than 10 years. So you don't get cited unless you continually revise your old work and bring it up to date. And you have to remind people that they should go back and look at the source. So that's why I'm starting with this topic, to go back to the source. And in doing this research on entrepreneurial universities, the two natural places to look at were, in the United States, were the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Stanford University. So from the mid-1980s, I was periodically visiting Stanford and interviewing faculty and students in different areas. I recall an interview in 1986 with a young professor of computer science who wouldn't say anything. But I found out later that he was involved in a startup in computer science, but at that time, it wasn't that proper for an academic, even at Stanford, to say that they were involved in a business venture. His startup was very successful, and it was later sold for a lot of money, and he became the first president of Stanford to come from an entrepreneurial science background. So He's currently now a little older and grayer and balder, but he rose through the academic ranks as an entrepreneurial scientist to become the president, and was the first one from this background to take the leadership of the university. Before that, the key person in moving the university in this direction was the Dean of Engineering and then the Provost of the university, Frederick Terman, who was a student of Vannevar Bush at MIT, who was also the key person at MIT as a student of the consulting engineers who were brought into MIT to start research at that institution in the early 20th century. But at that time, in the early 20th century, Stanford was a very small school. It wasn't the world-class university that we know of it as today. It was basically a small teaching college with some research in a few areas. And its engineering school had a problem. It was located in an agricultural region. Silicon Valley was then known as the Valley of Heart's Delight. Apricot trees, fruit trees. That was the economy of the region where Stanford is located. And Stanford itself, the land was donated. It was a ranch. And there are still cows grazing today on the upper parts of the campus. And so the leadership of the engineering school knew that you couldn't have a great engineering school if all the graduates, once they finished, were going to move away to other parts of the country. So even in the early 20th century, they were involved in helping graduates form firms and invested in those firms. These weren't firms based on advanced research. Typically, they were firms that were doing technology transfer in the traditional sense of moving a known technology from one place in electrical equipment, for example, from the eastern United States to California to establish electrical equipment in that region. So it's from that base that the entrepreneurial university at Stanford began, because they knew they couldn't be a great university unless the university was surrounded by technical industry. And so in the early days then, students were interns in the firm. And the presence of the industry helped develop the teaching and research capacity of the university. And so it's often argued that rather than Stanford as a university being crucial to the development of Silicon Valley, which it was, but that the emerging technical industry in Silicon Valley was crucial to the development of Stanford. And so this was the situation in the engineering school. And then by the late 1930s, Professor Terman then became a dean. But as a professor, even in those years, he was trying to raise money to support his students, to stay on as graduate students. And so he would collect new inventions from the professors in the electrical engineering department, and he would license them to companies, usually where a Stanford graduate was the research director. And so he would license to IIT, International Telephone and Telegraph, ITT, in New York. And mostly because the head of the R&D department was a graduate, was willing to take the technology and pay something for it. And with those funds, he supported students like Hewlett and Packard. And from a research project at the university, they developed a piece of equipment which became the basis for their company. In the garage, which you can now visit today, it's now an historical site. And it's always said on the days that the garage door was opened, there was no business. And when it was closed, they were hard at work. But their first sale of their equipment was to the Disney company in Southern California. to provide advanced sound equipment for the film Fantasia, which was made in the late 30s in stereophonic sound, where it was shown in a few movie theaters that were specially reconstructed to show this advanced film, which was basically showing classical music exemplified with cartoon characters, and is still a classic to this day. But the sound, the high quality sound, was based on this invention that came out of the university and was the first serious sales that the firm had. And the firm grew with contracts during the Second World War. And after the war, Terman, during the war, he went back to Massachusetts, where he got his PhD at MIT, and he was head of the Radar Countermeasures Laboratory, which is located in the biological laboratories at Harvard. And in 1943, he wrote a letter to his friend, the treasurer of Stanford, and he said, after the war, we must follow the MIT model and collect the massive government funds for research that were pouring into MIT during the war, which expanded the university enormously. So the war started with a few dozen researchers working on radar. But by the time the war ended, there were 5,000 working, scattered all throughout the university and industrial buildings in the area. Now, after the war, of course, it was scaled down. But the university kept the basic research part of the radar lab. And that became the basis for the development of electronics research at MIT on a massive scale. And Terman took that model to Stanford and formed an institute, Stanford Research Institute, to collect government funds to do research for industry and government. And that began the scale-up of research at Stanford. And then there was a study done in the late 60s. All through the 50s and 60s, enormous government funds were being given to universities to support research. It was intended that the research would be basic research, primarily, but even so, the notion of basic research is supposed to be connected to it and applied research and development. It's supposed to be the linear model. So after some length of time, something useful is supposed to come of it, even if you fund it as basic research. But a study was done that showed only 2 inventions commercialized after all of these billions of dollars of funding of the universities. And so, at that point, there began to be a movement to change the system in order to encourage some practical outcomes from the research. It was, in a sense, an underground movement. There were people in government agencies who were responsible for doing something with the intellectual property produced at the universities. Since it was paid for with federal government funds, legally, it was owned by the government. But the American government wasn't going to go into the business of commercializing research. That wasn't the way it conceived of its role in society. And on the other hand, there were a few universities in which professors were involved in forming firms, at MIT and Stanford, and a few other places. And a few universities had people with the responsibility for encouraging technology transfer. Terman had been doing it informally in the 30s. But by 1969, the university formed an office to encourage technology transfer. And several other universities had. And so there was an interaction between the government officials and the university officials. And I remember I interviewed the legal counsel for the National Science Foundation, who told me that the most satisfying thing he did in his career in government was to help work out a bureaucratic procedure to allow the universities to take control of the intellectual property owned by government and put them to use. And so they invented a procedure whereby a university had to show that it was qualified to take the intellectual property. They had to have some procedures, some people in place to do technology transfer. And so instead of the arrangements being made on an individual basis, it could be made for all of the research going through the university. And so that was the beginnings of scaling up technology transfer and putting in place a system whereby the useful outcomes of basic research will be translated to inventions, licensed to industry, or made the basis of startup firms. So the two greatest sources of funding for research in the States are funding for the military, and next, funding for health research. Directly after the Second World War, there was an idea to have a national health service system, as in the UK. But whereas it passed in the UK, it failed in the States. So instead of funding going to cure people, the money for health went into research. And the National Institutes of Health, which is a very small organization before the Second World War, grew into an enormous size with separate institutes for every different disease. And now it has a budget of 20 or more billion dollars. But this National Institutes of Health was only a small part of a much larger government organization at the time, the Department of Health and Human Services. And one day, the Secretary of Health and Human Services heard about this business going on of transferring the government's intellectual properties to universities. And he said, that's wrong. We shouldn't be doing that, giving away publicly produced knowledge for universities to make money from by commercializing. And he canceled all of those agreements that it made with the universities. And so what happened next was that the people inside government, who were responsible for intellectual property, and the people running the technology transfer offices, still a relatively small group, they got together and they drafted a bill to put into the legislative process. And to actually introduce a bill, you need the legislators to do that. So they found Senator Bai and Senator Dole, a Democrat and a Republican, both from states whose universities were active in technology transfer. And they all agreed that was a good idea. The university said this is important to them. And so they introduced this bill, which was eventually passed. There was one group in the country, one interest group opposed to it. And that is the represented large corporations were opposed to passing this, because the law said that the government will transfer the intellectual property rights of the research that it was paying for, and the universities will own it, but a significant share of the profits, the results, had to go to the inventors, the professors and students. Well, from the late 19th century on, it used to be, if you worked for a railroad company in the late 19th century, you owned the rights to any invention you produced, even if you were an employee of the railroad, and the railroad had to buy it from you. Well, that didn't last very long. Soon, they had their lawyers make employment contracts, which said that you had to turn over all your intellectual property rights to the company as a condition of employment. And so the most in industry, you would get a certificate or maybe a little bonus if you invent something, but you don't share in the rewards. And that's been accepted in the American legal system to this day. So the large corporations thought, well, if there's something in this law that says university presses get a significant share, someday that could be extended to employees of companies. So being far-seeing industrialists, they didn't want that to happen, so they opposed the law. But in this case, the lobby from universities and from government, and also the circumstance that at that time, industry in America was declining, and was a great concern with how to renew it. And one of the ideas was to increase the contribution of knowledge from universities as the basis of new products. And so it was on that basis of seeing it as a way to future economic development that the law gained widespread support. So that is the origins of the Bayh-Dole Act, coming bottom up through this coalition. So at Stanford, over the years, there were a group of professors who became very experienced at forming firms from their research. Serial entrepreneurs. For a while, it was thought that professors who became successful in forming firms would leave the university. But they rarely did. They knew they stayed there working with their students, that they would get the idea, the next firm, and the next one. And so they didn't leave, but they stayed as professors, would take leaves of absence every once in a while, and help form a new firm. And there was a technology transfer office, which started out as a very small group in 1969, that had grown into about 35 people by the time that I came to study them in 2004, 2005, as a participant observer in the Office of Technology Licensing. And the director was very interested in having the office study. She invited many researchers to look at different aspects of it, and I was asked to study interdisciplinary research projects and how they became transferred. And I analyzed the projects, I interviewed the people involved in about a half dozen of these projects. And what I eventually concluded was that it was purely accidental that these projects were successfully transferred. I'll give you an example of one of them. A professor had an invention of a process by which you could mechanize the analysis of biotechnological data. And he needed it built as a machine. And so he walked over to the engineering school and he talked to different professors. And nobody was interested. He said, this isn't basic research. At that time, engineering schools had moved to being very scientifically oriented, not practically oriented. So no interest to us, they said. But then he reached one professor and said, I have a PhD student who's come here to the university to get his PhD because he wants to be located in Silicon Valley and have the chance to organize a startup. He introduced the professor to the student. The professor who made the invention didn't believe in forming firms. This was against his ethic. He believed any knowledge that he produced should be given out freely, and anyone should do what they want with it. But he wanted this device to be built. And so he agreed that the student could form a firm. And so it went through the Office of Technology Licensing. They marketed to other firms, but nobody was willing to invest in it in an existing larger firm. And so the license went to this startup. Well, the fact that it happened to come together with this professor finding this student who was interested, well, that's not a systematic way to transfer technology. It's purely accidental that these elements came together. And I found my finding was similar to the other cases that I looked at. At the end of my stay in the office, the director asked me to give a talk at the regular weekly meetings of the group. And so what I said was, you're doing great. You're the leading technology transfer office in the world, and Stanford is the leading entrepreneurial university. But you're woefully underperforming the potential that the university has for technology transfer and producing startups. There are 35 of you, but you only have time to work with the serial entrepreneurs, the professors who've done it over and over again. You don't have time to pay attention to people who have a good idea but don't know what to do with it. Your policy is to offer them an introduction to a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. But these people don't know what to do with such an introduction. They don't know how to make business. And so they go away and don't do anything. And the idea for a firm disappears into a conversation. And so my conclusion was that Stanford had an entrepreneurship gap. But how can you prove that? As hypothetical. So I didn't publish the paper that I had written at that time. I talked to the Dean of Research. I did try hard to get this idea analysis across. But the Dean of Research said, I don't pay any attention to the Technology Transfer Office. It's so successful. It's not on my radar. He said, if it's not broken, fix it. I say, if it's working well, make it better. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, they invited me to stay on, but it wasn't going to be interesting, so I took an invitation to take a chair in the UK at Newcastle University. But by 2009, I finished my work there, and I came back to Stanford as a fellow of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research. My other line of research is on women's experience and women in science and technology, and a book called Athena Unbound, the Advancement of Women in Science and Technology. So I was there in the Gender Research Institute, and then I decided to stay on. I moved to another part of the university. And then I came across a group called StarX, which was formed in 2010 by the student government at Stanford. Student government, since the founding of the university in 1891, is a legally independent organization from the university. It has its own budget and resources. It sponsors the student newspaper. At many universities, if the student newspaper says something that the administration doesn't like, it can be stopped. Stanford, no control by the administration over the student newspaper or any activities of the student government. And so, there were students at Stanford who were trying to form firms, who were trying to be entrepreneurial. Sometimes they had majored in entrepreneurial studies in business school or in the engineering school. There's a program, STVP, for engineers. But they came to the conclusion that they didn't really have the skills and resources to really form a successful firm. And they needed help. And so, one of these graduates, by now, Cameron Titleman, and some of his friends, formed an organization within student government to research this problem. They interviewed Stanford alumnus working in venture capital firms and in technology industries in the Valley, and the professors in the university teaching entrepreneurship, and their fellow students who were trying to be entrepreneurs about the problems and difficulties of doing this. And they concluded that this gap at Stanford needed to be filled. To this day, Stanford does not have an incubator facility. The university believes that since it's located in Silicon Valley, all the resources are available. You just have to go out and make use of them. And so in some ways, Stanford is behind other universities in less auspicious circumstances that know they need to fill this gap because it's so obvious. But Stanford doesn't believe there's a gap. But the students knew there was. And so they organized an Accelerator Project that lasts one quarter, one academic quarter, or 12 weeks. And it has a vetting process, and like making application to the university. Very difficult process at Stanford, written application, interviews. But to get admitted to StartX, you don't apply as an individual. You apply as an entrepreneurial team. You already have to have gone as far as forming a team. And then they analyze the potential of that team and also see what its gaps are. So even those, the 10% that are successful and get admitted to the project, there's been an analysis done of what their strengths and weaknesses are and where they need help. And then they connect this group to mentors sourced from the alumni working in Silicon Valley. So each nascent beginning startup gets a board of directors, of advisors, from professionals in organizing firms in Silicon Valley. And they get space, workspace. What they did was they got a donation from a firm in the Stanford Research Park, the America Online Corporation. You may have heard of this. It's one of the first firms in the email space, but it's been declining. So lots of empty space in their building. And so they gave some of that space to StartX. I guess they probably, it's for goodwill, they probably get a tax advantage. And so StartX started in the AOL building. In 2011, I was at a seminar at Birkbeck in London on these issues. And my good friend and colleague and co-developer of the triple helix concept, Professor Luke Leidersdorf, who's a bibliometrician. He counts the papers and articles and things that you produce. And he had come to the conclusion that the Bayh-Dole effect had come to an end, the effects of this law. There had been a slowdown, a slight downturn, a downtick in '06. He jumped to the conclusion that this was the end of technology transfer. Now, I think you can find a lot of other reasons for why that happened. And then a few years later, it went up again. So he wrote another paper explaining why it went up, pulling ideas out of the sky, as people often do in doing quantitative analysis. Anything plausible can be made to fit the data. Anyway, Luke said, from the Association of University Technology Managers, which is now the large professional association of technology transfer people in the States, the autumn data shows Stanford produces 7 startups per year. And he concluded, if Stanford, the world's leading entrepreneurial university, can only produce 7 startups, what hope is there for the European university? Not worth trying. Can never catch up to even this modest amount. Well, by that time, in 11, I had the data from StartX. 48 firms per year coming out of the StartX process. It wasn't as if they magically appeared. But these were firms that formerly would have been conversations that came to a dead end because the people wouldn't know what to do next because there wasn't the support structure for the people who weren't serial entrepreneurs and knew how to do it from repeated experience. But now, these conversations going on in research groups around the university involving not only students, but professors, postdoctoral fellows, these groups had a place to take their idea and their potential startup. And so from that enormous research base and research groups, now there was a pipeline created to make those conversations and ideas for firms into actual firms through the mentorship that they received in the StartX Accelerator, with the usual kinds of things like preparing for a demo day at the end and making your pitch to investors and so on. Most of it is well-known methods. But the key in this place, in this condition, was to place this in the context of the world's leading entrepreneurial university, which was woefully underperforming, even though it's the greatest success in the world. So I call this phenomenon the paradox of success. That when you're successful, you don't think it can go any further. And so you take it as the level that you have reached, and you stop there. And you stop there. And it's hard for anyone to question you and say you could do more, because you're the world leader. How can you question and say that Stanford is underperforming? I was saying that Stanford is operating on only 1 or 2 cylinders of its potential. But when I mentioned this to the dean of the business school at Newcastle, what did he say? Oh, but what a cylinder! Because it's way ahead of everywhere else in the world. But nevertheless, it was only reaching a small amount of its potential. But to prove that, it took more than a research analysis. You had to put this model into action. Only by translating this social science analysis into a new institution, a new organization, could you prove the case. So when StartX organized their project, and it's now been going on for 5 years, they proved my analysis. And so what has happened since? It's had the effect that a lot of students then take leaves of absence from their studies in order to go into the StartX Accelerator. Some may not complete and not graduate. At one point, the university tried to close it down, feeling it was interfering with the academic process. Stanford University tried to close down the StartX Accelerator. But the students protested. They got petitions and support, and so the administration backed down. And instead of trying to close it, what did they do? Well, if you can't, you know the old saying, if you can't beat them, join them. So the university now gives StartX a grant each year of $2.5 million. And so they've moved from the Aero building to a much larger space they pay rent on. And they now have the capacity to double and triple the number of startups coming through. And their analysis is that their proportion, their success rate is too high. It's too high, which must mean that there are people there not admitting that could probably be successful, or at least a high rate. And so they should have a low rate of success to take care of the numbers that are potentially coming through. And then, from studying this, I had a business idea, which I haven't found investors for yet. But there's a Chinese company that is considering it now. And I'll tell you the idea. Since StartX had such a good vetting process, I figured that to be an investor, a venture investor in it, you didn't need to do due diligence, because it had been done for you. And the problem that a venture firm has in making seed investments are the amount of money is too small. They have too much money. So they have to move up the chain, upstream, to invest in larger. When successes, the firm's already grown. And so they tend not to invest at this very early stage. So my concept was to offer an investment of $30,000 to $50,000 in any firm that got admitted to startups. And then do analysis later on for larger investments in them. I was a couple of weeks ago in China. I'm an advisor to the Shandong Academy of Sciences and Technology. They're moving from being an institute into more innovation work. And then I went on to visit Guangzhou, Jiaotang University. They're very interested in developing the entrepreneurial university concept. And I went there to meet with the leadership of the education school there to discuss this. But the people who brought me there arranged for me to have another meeting in the afternoon at the hotel with the head of the science park from the university. But apparently, in talking, he was head of several science parks and of a company that ran the university's science parks, and now a bunch of other businesses. So I did my interview of science park director with him. I had an interview for incubator director, science park director, entrepreneurial student, professor, and whatnot. And when I finished the interview, I asked him, "Why do you want to meet with me?" And he said, "I'm looking for an idea to make money." And so I told him my idea for this investment firm. Well, I didn't show you any of the slides, but I guess you could have the slide set and look at them later. This is the story of an entrepreneurial university, StartX and the Paradox of Success at Stanford. But basically, it's not a unique process. It's something that can be done at any university. If you look back at the origins of Stanford, it was a small college in an agricultural region. But through its interaction with the few technology firms that existed at that time, it built up the university's research base. And they systematically developed the university. Terman had the idea that any university can completely renew itself in an academic generation if you invested strategically in new faculty members. And what you do is not hire one person. Universities, when someone retires, they hire someone to replace them in the same field. Terman believed hire a half dozen people in the same research field. Pick an emerging research field with both theoretical and practical potential and invest heavily in that. A half dozen people who interact with each other. And then they can teach much more broadly to cover the teaching. But hire them as a tight group in this area. And so first, of course, this happened in engineering, in microwave engineering. And then later in steroid chemistry. And it spread throughout the university as they had the resources. And to get the resources, they had the government funding the research, but that wasn't enough. What did they have? They had this huge tract of land, a ranch. But legally, you couldn't sell any of that land. And so what did they do? Suburbanization was coming and replacing the agriculture. And so they said, we can build a shopping center and make money from that. So you go to Stanford today and enter the campus, you'll see this classic 1950s shopping center. And in the archives at Stanford, Professor Terman's papers, you'll see he's counting the receipts, rent receipts from the shopping center. And he says, now I can hire a new professor. And then, after the shopping center was successful, they decided, let's take another piece of land and make an industrial park. Attract firms leaving San Francisco. But San Francisco was 40 miles away. So nobody came from San Francisco to the Stanford Science Park. But who did come? Firms that developed out of research at the university, like Hewlett-Packard and Varian and others. They wanted to stay close to the university to keep their intellectual connections and keep ideas fresh in the firm. And so Terman realized what was happening, and he reformulated the project from an industrial park into what we now know of as a science park. I was on the board of advisors several years ago of the International Association of Science Parks. And their rules for a science park is exactly the rule that Terman specified at Stanford. It has to be a firm that wants to be closely related to the university, a research-based firm. At EASP, they don't know where this idea came from. They just know this is what a science park is supposed to be. But this is how the science park was invented. Out of this process of developing resources to create an expanded entrepreneurial university. But today, the Stanford Science Park is mostly filled with large firms, well advanced, not with new startups. It's too expensive for new startups. The closest thing to a new startup in the Stanford Science Park is Skype, which is now a branch of Microsoft. So Stanford Science Park today needs renewal. So what I've said to this Chinese company, well, they like to build science parks next to universities. I know a good piece of land. You should come, build a science park there, and then use this investment model. Because Stanford took part of the idea. Stanford will offer to take 10% of the A round of any firm that has come through the StartX process. So in the late 90s, Stanford changed its policy from not taking equity in firms coming to the university to taking a small percentage. So when Google went public, the university got over $200 million. It sounds like a lot of money. But the Stanford Management Corporation, which was responsible for investing in the endowment of the university, they thought this was a failure. Only $200 million, when billions were being made from it. And so they tried to change the rules again to increase the percentage. But there was resistance from the venture capital firms, because if Stanford increases the percentage, then the percentage available to the firms will go down. So, more or less, they agreed it could go up a little bit. So now Stanford, when it invests in a firm, will get up to 3 or 4%. So my hypothesis, in the article I wrote in 1983, was that the future of the university will be that it will be transformed from an eleemosynary or charitable institution which receives resources from other areas of society into one which is capable of generating its own resources. This is still a far-off view, but now it's in the process of becoming true. Thank you.
So now we have the chance for questions and answers or Q&A.
Thank you very much for the lecture. It was absolutely incredible. And I have actually several questions. Did I get it right that StartX is available only for the students of Stanford University or not? This is the first question. I probably will ask you the list of questions, then you will answer, yeah? Is it more convenient like that?
Okay, the rule is that each firm that goes into StartX has to have a student.
At least one.
At least one. But everyone else can be professor, PhD, whatever. Now, recently, there's a weekly event in the engineering school one credit course that's organized by the students, in which an entrepreneur from Silicon Valley comes to speak, or something related to innovation. And Cameron Titleman, the head of StartX, gave a talk recently. And somebody asked him, what's happened to the original vision of StartX, which is supposed to be the students? Now you have all these professors involved in it. And of course he said the original rule still holds, that there has to be a student involved, at least in the firm. But what they didn't realize was, when they started it, that not only students needed help and support structure, but so did most of the faculty, who had no notion of how to go about forming a firm. The faculty divides into three groups. Those who are the serial entrepreneurs, experienced and have done it. On the other side, there are those who are totally opposed and think it's a degradation of the university to be involved in commercialization of your research. But in the middle, there's a broad group that has ideas, that would like to be involved, but don't know how to do it. They need that support. So that's not just true of undergraduates, true of graduate students, PhDs now. What's happening to the PhD? In the United States, 10% perhaps of science PhDs can expect to get a job in academia as a professor. What's going to happen to all the rest? For many years, people still went and got their PhDs, expected them to become professors, and toward the end they realized there had to be another route. But now, people go into a PhD program know that the chances are small that they're going to find a job as a professor. What is their best chance for a job? It's by taking the technology or ideas that they've invented in their PhD process and making that into a firm. And doing that whether or not they complete the PhD. And so that's another source of customers for StartX. And there's still a gap at Stanford. You know, for IT, you just need a desk and computers. But there's no place to do a biotechnology startup at Stanford. Some of the people from StartX organized, the ones who had formed biotechnology firms, organized a meeting with the president of Stanford to make the case. And they asked me to advise them on what to say in this meeting. They had the meeting, and at first the president was saying, oh, not necessary. We have all the resources in Silicon Valley. We don't need to provide a special place to do this. But then, after listening for a while, he said he would consider it. And then he turned it over to the Office of Technology Licensing to study it further. And they did interviews and looked at the biotechnology incubators. And I happen to know the result of the story because I knew the people at the University of California, San Francisco's QB3 incubator. And they told me that basically the Stanford people didn't want to do it. Basically, the Office of Technology Licensing is stuck in an early, highly successful marketing model of technology transfer. Whereas technology transfer has moved on from just licensing to being an innovation and business development model at many universities now. But they're still in the old model. And so they try to stop any new development from happening because that would change their situation in the world. And so there still is no biotechnology incubator at Stanford. But basically, the gap was much broader than just the students. And that's why the people going through the process are now much broader than students. It needs a much broader need. There are also other groups that have appeared to fill this gap at Stanford. There's a project called Spark in the medical school that provides support for translational research, how to take your basic research idea and move it to the next steps. And it includes some lectures by people from Silicon Valley so you get some sense of what the entrepreneurial experience is like. So that's kind of a pre-preparation for StartX. And then there's a similar program for medical devices. And there are various programs in the business school that simulate the development of a firm, and very often people continue on after the course. And in the mechanical engineering department, for decades, there's been a course which goes a year long, it's interdisciplinary, and brings together graduate students from across the university to work on problems posed by companies to solve, with a mentor and funds to the company. And very often, after they solve the problem, sometimes they keep going as a startup. And so there's developing, in the past 10 years, a whole series of projects and organizations at the university that are filling this entrepreneurship gap. So while I focused on Stanford, on StartX today, the story is bigger and much more variegated but this is the key to showing that there was the gap.
Thank you very much. May I ask another question? There are a lot of talented Russian programmers and developers who go to Silicon Valley. What is the general attitude towards these developers? And do you have some of them in StartX from Russia?
Okay. Well, as I said, you have to be from Stanford. So if there are students or people from Russia in Stanford, they can apply to it. Or in the summer, the program is open to anyone from anywhere in the world. So I don't know the data closely enough to know if there have been Russians at StartX, but there could be. There could be. Chances are...
What's the attitude?
What's
the attitude towards Russians? When considering all the sanctions, political situations and everything.
In Silicon Valley, I think the only thing they care about is, are you useful to them? It's a very business-oriented culture, and that's all they care about. They're totally ignorant about the role the government played in the development of Silicon Valley. They think it's all out of the businesses and firms that have been formed. They don't think the university is important. They're just concerned about having qualified technical people to work in their firms wherever they're from. There are firms that come to Silicon Valley from Russia and establish a base there as a way to market their technology. I followed one of these firms, 3D Bid, which has a 3D software that makes a two-dimensional picture into a three-dimensional one from Tomsk. That's located there. Last week, I went around to some of the visits that a group that was sent from Moscow City government, sent a group of 15 young entrepreneurs to make a tour around Silicon Valley, visiting some of the different incubators and entrepreneurship projects, led by a PhD student from Moscow State University who's doing research in Silicon Valley. I'm advising her a little bit on her thesis. One of the things we want her to do is to study StartX, because I haven't been able to follow in detail, because they want a student to do the research. It's still student-oriented enough that they made that the requirement for access. So I'm hoping that that will work out, so that she'll be a part of StartX in terms of doing the study.
Thank you very much.
Next question, please. Next question.
So you mentioned that at a certain point of time, Stanford tried to shut down StartX because it interferes with students' academic performance. And so, given your experience, do you think that this kind of entrepreneurial activity jeopardizes students' performance when it comes to studies?
Well, you could say yes if you think of the university in the traditional course structure of lectures and seminars. But what I think is happening in university education, in fits and starts, is that some of the lectures are being replaced by the MOOCs. And one key point of data on that was during one of the early ones that was run from Stanford in the computer science department. It was intended that it would be for students everywhere in the world who wanted to learn about this computer science subject. But the students at Stanford wouldn't be using it. They would be interacting with their professors and teaching assistants, whatever. By the end of the course, most of the Stanford students were doing it on the internet. They weren't using the traditional educational means. So you could say that the brick and mortar university is going to disappear. You could draw that conclusion. But I think that's an unwarranted conclusion. Stanford is building buildings like crazy. And why does it need more space? Not only for the research projects, but these courses now that provide a project-based method of learning. For example, the Mechanical Engineering 310 course. It operates in a space that's dedicated 24/7 to the students to work on their projects, not an hour and a half twice a week. So you need more space, not less space, to house project-based courses. And so the brick and mortar university will continue, because this is where social capital is created among close interaction. Maybe someday we'll have a full virtual reality so that this is created over the internet, but we're still a ways away from that. And people still want to be face-to-face for other reasons than intellectual, shall we say. So I don't think brick and mortar university will disappear anytime soon, or at all, ever.
Any more questions? No, I don't have a question.
Please.
Sure, that's several, but I'll keep it to one. You're the architect of the triple helix model. A few years ago I read an article called the Quadruple Helix, in which they tried to develop a fourth strand or fourth dimension, which was broadly called public engagement or societal engagement. I wondered if you had any views on that view about the Quadruple Helix.
Yes, I have a few. I also have a wonderful picture that I don't have in this setting. It's a piece of conceptual art which shows a launch pad. Okay? And the launch pad of the triple helix is civil society. The ability to come together and freely associate and form discussions without any questions asked or permission. That's the basis of the optimum triple helix. So, the public or civil society is too important to have it as one of the helices. It's the platform on which the entire model is based. Now, of course, you can also have a top-down version, and these can be highly successful. We had that in the United States, especially in wartime. The Manhattan Project, top-down, run by the Army. Built an atomic bomb, and cities and everything in 3 years' time from basic research. So the top-down model can be very successful when you have a very narrow and clear goal in mind. But if you're looking at inventing new ideas from scratch and new types of organizations, not only technological, but also new social mechanisms, like the invention of the venture capital firm. It came out of interaction from people who came together in a new organization to freely associate and have that brainstorming and invention of new ideas. So, the civil society is the basis of an optimum triple helix.
Any more questions?
Yes, thank you. So we have the audience of students here, and this is very interesting to understand. How do you think the student involvement in Stanford startup movements and everything which happens in Stanford helps to develop the university? So first, what students can do to make the entrepreneurial university entrepreneurial? And if the university in America is not entrepreneurial, what does this mean? And what students can do to change a non-entrepreneurial university in America into entrepreneurial? We can try to understand if there are any comparisons between Russia and America.
Well, I think what's happening now at Stanford, the students have created an alternative educational process to the one that's part of the official curriculum. They have now invented an unofficial curriculum. But what will happen over time, I predict, is the unofficial curriculum being invented by the students, which I have to also say, also exists as part of the official curriculum, because there are professors who have these courses, project-based courses. But what will happen over time is that the unofficial curriculum will become included in the official curriculum, and instead of being in the university as just for a few students here and there, it'll be part of the general education of all students in the university. Even the president has said that the design school at Stanford, which is an unofficial school, it's not one of the official schools of the university, but it has grown equal in size. There's just a few professors who hold official positions at Stanford, but the rest of the teachers are graduates working in the design industry who teach part-time in the university. And they offer everything from regular semester length courses to short courses. And the president has said this should be part of the experience of all entering students at Stanford. Well, they haven't figured out how to put together enough teachers to do that, but that is now the official objective. And so the next steps would be to carry it through. And to make it part of the PhD training process. I was at a meeting in Zambia of education ministers from the East African Common Market. And my good colleague and friend, Professor Celestine Juma, from the Kennedy School at Harvard, made the comment that the gold standard for a contemporary PhD is 3 published articles. You know, not the old-fashioned, you write a long dissertation, but 3 published articles. I thought about this a while. And then I said, for an entrepreneurial university PhD, it should be 2 published articles. And the 3rd should be research carried forward into practical use, which you can then write about. But you should take it through the translational process and be credited for it as part of the degree program. Right now at Stanford, the projects like Spark, which include PhD students, is an extracurricular activity. They're doing that in addition to their PhD research. The founders of Google never got the degree. Shouldn't they have been given credit for Google as 1/3 of the PhD dissertation? Then Stanford could have these distinguished alumni and not have them as dropouts. It's all very nice and cute when you have a Bill Gates who drops out of Harvard or a Steve Jobs from Reed College. But if that number expands, then it's not so cute. Then the university loses part of its economic base and reason for existence. So the university, the entrepreneurial university, can not only be the university that creates spin-outs, transfers technology. It has to be an entrepreneurial university built into its teaching and training process. And so a transformation of the university from a focus on the individual to a focus on teaching people how to create organizations. For many years, I taught at an arts-based university in the suburbs of New York. Conservatory, music students, art students, humanities, and social science students, with a few science students, no engineering or business, much too practical. And I was kind of anomalous in taking up this line of research that I was doing. One day, I had a visitor, a colleague from Sweden, professor of entrepreneurship. And he spoke to my students about the business plan and the startup process. But it was clear they didn't have a clue as to what he was talking about. So we took a break, stopped the class, and came back 15 minutes later. And then I asked, who among you someday would like to start a theater group, a dance group, a school, a business? 2/3 of the students raised their hands. 2/3 wanted to be entrepreneurs without knowing what the concept meant. And in New York, in the arts, if you're not entrepreneurial, you end up as a head waiter in the Russian tea room, in a restaurant. And the university itself was operating on an incubation model without realizing it. Each year, the students came into the theater school. They were grouped as theater groups. In the dance school, as dance troupes. Some of them, when they graduated 4 years later, were moved from the suburbs into lower Manhattan and continue on as theater groups and dance troupes. This arts-based university was operating on an incubator model without knowing the meaning of the term. And so the university now consciously can realize this and engage in training of students on this project-based learning. Where I have seen this most clearly instantiated in the university is in Brazil. Several years ago, I was invited to a graduation ceremony at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. But it was a graduation not of individuals, but of firms from the university's incubator. A member of each firm came forward to say what they'd done in the 2 or 3 years in the incubator. The rector made a speech about realizing dreams. For a long time, I've been puzzled as to why there were more incubators in Rio de Janeiro than in New York. But in Brazil, they had adapted the incubator model from the States, but they had realized its full potential because they realized that the incubator is something broader than a way to help faculty members start a high-tech firm. But as an organizational model, it can be applied to help people start low-tech firms, medium-tech firms, no-tech firms. The incubator is a method of training a group of people to work together as an organization. And so, when the campaign, an NGO, the Campaign for Hunger, came together with the technological incubator at the Federal University, where they wanted to apply their incubator expertise to the social problems of the society, they invented the popular incubator. A way of training poor people from the favelas to organize cooperatives to create their own jobs. So that's the purest form of the incubator as a group training method. And so the incubator is part of the original teaching mission of the university. Not only is the newer third mission of contribution to economic and social development. And in many Brazilian universities, entrepreneurship is taught as part of general education to all the students in the university. I like to joke with my friends that training the theology students in entrepreneurship, you can get some results that you might not appreciate. Someone might start a new religion with this kind of training.
Thank you very much. I would like actually that you may realise that Philip and myself are currently developing, together with many of the heads of cathedra around this university, a new common core curriculum, which is responsive to these kinds of needs and demands. And we are ensuring or seeking to ensure that all students will have the opportunity to opt for new programs like project management, more hours in English, for example, business English, organizational management, communication skills, and so on. We think these are really important to your development as students within this university. And this is a very important part of the development of change within this university. I have a, what I might call a plain devil's advocate question, because I don't accept the answer myself, but I'm going to put a difficult question to you, which I've been put to on several occasions. If there is, for example, a very high mortality rate in student startup businesses, whereby students may lose their career opportunities or lose their funding, their friends' funding, their family funding, in a failed business, why should we promote it as a major development in a university?
Well, I don't necessarily believe all the hype on the virtues of failure. I think it's being overdone. But so far, 90% of the firms going through the StartX process 3 or 4 years later are still going. And even if they weren't, the learning experience of how to create an organization that'll stand you in good stead if you do work for a large organization. You'll be the one who takes initiative. And probably in your career, you're going to do many different things. Work for a startup, work for a large organization, work for government, come back and work for the university. We're going to see a lot more. I have a slide somewhere showing circulation around the Triple Helix. And not only circulation, but 2 roles at once. A double life person. Half time in university, half time in business and government. A professor of practice. We instituted a research-based professor of practice at Newcastle University when I was there. The idea being was to attract back to the university PhDs who've done successful startup firms. And when your firm is successful, what happens? They kick you out as the CEO. And you become a troublemaker in the firm, trying to get your old job back. And so these were people, though, if you attract them back to the university, they would think on a larger scale. They would mentor future entrepreneurs. And so we established 3 of these positions at Newcastle. There, it was only acceptable as an experiment. My thesis is when at least 20% of the university faculty consists of such people, then you're qualified as an entrepreneurial university. At Stanford, that's the case. There are all kinds of professors of practice and consulting professors. A good proportion of the faculty has a significant role in another part of society. So that gives you a criteria for knowing when ITMU is a full-fledged entrepreneurial university. Well, here's the commercial. This is a new journal that we established in the Triple Helix Association. Triple Helix, a journal of university, industry, government, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And it has a couple of unique features. I heard a lecture from a professor at the University of Chicago at Stanford saying that if you want to reach developing countries, you shouldn't charge for your journal. You should make it open access. But then if you make a journal open access, that means the writers pay. You're just shifting the costs around. And so our journal is triple open access. We're able to raise enough money so we don't have to charge either authors or writers. We're open to all innovation perspectives, not just the Triple Helix. So that's 1. No charge to authors, no charge to readers. You just go on the website, you can have access to everything. Second special feature. It's published in English, but it's also going to be published in Russian, because our sponsor is a Russian university. And so they have the rights to translate it, and this is an online journal, but they say in Russia, you have to have it in print, so hard copy. So they want it printed as well. So that's fun. But then we go further than that. All of the abstracts are translated into the official United Nations language, plus Portuguese. And why Portuguese? Because we have a lot of people working on the triple helix who are from Brazil. And in addition to the journal, for full academic articles, we have a magazine called Helix, which is Portuguese for helix, for 3,000 to 4,000 word articles from practitioners, from students, about interesting projects or experiences you're involved in innovation, which comes out 4 times a year. Again, also available freely on the website. And of course, you can also become a member of the Triple Helix Association. Student membership is 25 euros a year. And we're now organizing webinars that are available. So check out the website, www.triplehelixassociation.org, and become involved. There are already a number of Russian students and professors from different universities that are involved. And in fact, we just held the 13th Triple Helix Conference that started in 1996 in Amsterdam, New York, Rio de Janeiro. Our most recent conference was in Tomsk. And I can say that what was unique about that meeting was that Moscow came to Tomsk. The leadership of Skoltech, bringing along their professors from MIT. And the universities in Tomsk all came together with the administration of the region to support the conference. Over 300 delegates. And there'll be special issues for the journal coming out of this process. And so there's also now an association of Russian entrepreneurial universities that we're now going to work to scale up to the international level as the Union of Entrepreneurial Universities. You can guess where the idea of the union came from our Russian colleague, or shall I say our Soviet colleague. Okay, thank you.
Just before we finish, I'd just like to say a few words on behalf of the university to Professor Ickovitz. First of all, what the professor demonstrated for us is that, in fact, the history and origin of entrepreneurship within the university sector is demonstrated how universities, and in particular Stanford, has changed and transformed itself over years to accommodate student demand for their own entrepreneurial opportunities. And it's also given us a rich diversity of the different outcomes and developments which have taken place as a result of these new developments within Stanford University. And interestingly, of course, Professor Ickovitz is himself an entrepreneur. And I was particularly keen to see that in the last 5 minutes, we saw immediately how he had already set up a journal, how he'd set up an association, and how the association itself had gone global. So here we have an entrepreneurial professor doing exactly as he preaches, being entrepreneurial in his own way. So on behalf of Ickovitz University and on behalf of the students and staff here and faculty, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for your very interesting presentation today.
Thank you.